going to have another fantastic conversation. I'm thrilled to say that we have Jenna Bryant and Jordan Noone of Embedded Ventures. They're joining us. They're going to have a conversation with Justin Fiaschetti of Inversion, and they're going to be speaking about space applications and working with the DoD. Well, this is a fantastic and timely topic, and we're really looking forward to your conversation. So thank you all for joining us. We really appreciate it. Hello, Jenna.
Awesome. How's everybody doing?
Doing great. Jordan, great to see you. Justin, great to see you. We got the 3 J's.
That's right.
Sounds like a group. I don't know. But anyway, glad that you're here. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Jenna.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Well, yeah, I'm here with Jordan Noone, who's my co-founder here at Embedded Ventures. He's also the co-founder and founding CTO of Relativity Space, as well as the co-founder of one of our awesome portfolio companies, Inversion Space, Justin Fiaschetti. So let's dive right in. Jordan, why don't you kick us off by going over your backstory and including how you and Justin met each other?
Yeah, happy to be here today. Thank you for the introductions. And for me, my introduction to the venture and startup world was starting Relativity Space back in 2015. I was co-founder and founding chief technology officer there for the first 5 years of the company. The company's vision was to 3D print rockets and develop the world's largest metal 3D printers. And we flew the first of those in March of this year. I had stepped out of my full-time role at Relativity about 3 years ago, got the company to a size where I didn't love the day-to-day as much. You know, a 2-person company versus a 1,200-person company are very different things day-to-day. And Jenna Bryant, who had actually been an industry friend of mine for a couple of years prior to then, had asked me to first come on as an advisor to this new fund she was starting, Embedded Ventures. That made sense to me to at first, kind of get to know, what did I want to do next? And that led to her inviting me to be a co-founder and co-GP at the fund with her. So excited to be working with companies like Inversion and Justin and what they're doing. And Justin was originally actually a Relativity intern prior to forming Inversion, which is where we had first met.
And Justin, why don't you tell us more about what led to your career in aerospace and what makes Inversion unique?
Yeah, no, happy to. And thank you for having me today. So like Jordan mentioned, I had worked at Relativity, also had worked at SpaceX prior to starting Inversion. And myself and my co-founder really noticed that there was no good way to get back from space. There's a lot of launch capacity that has gotten built and a lot of in-space applications, whether that be imaging or satellite communications, etc. But we realized no one was really doing anything about getting back from space. And when we started thinking about it, we really realized that space has a lot of unique aspects that can be leveraged for global delivery of cargo. And so that's kind of what we're doing at Inversion. We're building reentry vehicles to make delivery from space a reality. It's been about a century since we've introduced a new domain of transportation, which was with the aircraft in the sky. We figured, hey, we might as well go and do this right now because launch costs has come down and the DoD is spending tremendous amounts of money to move faster. And by delivering cargo from space, we can deliver cargo to anywhere on Earth in under an hour. And that's kind of the thesis of an Inversion.
Awesome. And Justin, how have you navigated working with the government and, what have you learned through your experience with the Department of Defense so far? Is there any advice you would share with the founder who came to you for advice?
Yeah, so like a little backstory on Inversion. So we are like fundamentally a dual use company. We actually started off like very focused on commercial and like what are the commercial applications of reentry. And what we really found was the killer application for us was within the Defense Department around this rapid logistics side of things. So we've leaned pretty heavily into it. And working with the DoD is interesting, right? Especially for a newcomer, a new company that doesn't have any connections in. I think one of the hardest parts was figuring out who to talk to, who's the right person, who can make decisions, et cetera, et cetera. And so we solved that by kind of having advisors and like honestly having to just like iterate a ton. But that's definitely been one of the biggest learnings is making sure to talk to the right person because there's a lot of people and very few people that can say yes.
And so we know that hardware companies tend to have longer exit timelines. So Jordan, what do you think needs to happen in order for hardware companies to survive what we call the valley of death?
One of the favorite ways that I see companies kind of thrive through that phase of growth then is seeing that dual use potential be kind of truly realized. Then, and what I'm getting at there is you see a lot of startups that need private capital and don't have the customer traction then in order to attract further private capital. And one of the great customer signals that can happen is a customer signal starting to be generated from within the US government, the Pentagon, the intelligence community, other groups where they know what capability they need. They can rely on that private capital to help grow those companies and mutually de-risk them, where you see private capital coming in to help grow and scale these dual use applications. And you see the public customer coming in to help de-risk to the private investor that there is going to be a long-term use case. There is going to be customer applications and demand manifested if that private capital comes in. So if you see that balance hand in hand, that has happened a couple times in the industry, and where that mutual de-risking leads towards a very aggressive growth and outside of that valley of death. But you sometimes see occasions where that's mismatched and you have, the public customer looking at companies that aren't getting any private capital to help fuel their growth or help accelerate the growth. And you see some cases where the private investor is going after these companies that the public customer could never use or never adopt.
Yeah, one thing I would add to that, as like this is the thing that's top of mind for us. We've actually noticed that demand signal from the DoD has continuously shifted in what is valuable. So it used to be that like you get like an SBIR or something like that, and it would be like, oh, awesome, like there's demand signal, like throw money at this company. And now that's shifting to much more focused like on the like StratFi effort, which is an effort through AFWorks and SpaceWorks that provides matching funding up to $15 million for startups. And that's kind of the new bar of a place that you have to get to. And I suspect that it will actually continue to move up, right? Eventually it'll be, you need a program of record to really have that like major step change in demand signal. And that's something we've noticed is like, as the DoD has gone more into like startups and supporting small businesses and venture-backed companies, they're more of a spray and pray approach, which like perhaps makes sense, but has limited the amount of signal that like early SBIRs and those kind of things actually have for private venture.
And Justin, looking back to the commercial side, how do you think the DoD should be thinking about commercial use cases, and does that differ from their current strategy?
Yeah, so I think that like in venture capital, kind of the way that venture capitalists look at a company is if this works, will it be massive, right? And they're comfortable with a pretty high loss rate. The DoD probably shouldn't take that same approach, right? Like we probably don't want a bunch of companies that like, yeah, if it works, it's huge, but like it's going to be like very rare that it works. And having the DoD invest in those types of companies that have that commercial use case. Basically what that means is the DoD should probably spend a decent amount of effort and time trying to validate a commercial market and a commercial use case, and not necessarily just taking venture's word for it, because the incentives sometimes are misaligned. And so really diving into like, does this actually have a commercial market? Is it like physically feasible, or are they relying on 4 additional startups to be built in the time that they're going to have to build their company?
Yeah, so continuing on that thread, I want to hear from both of you on what bottlenecks in both venture and the government do y'all think needs to be overcome in the next 5 years?
I'll start with that one. I'd say the biggest bottleneck, and Justin had highlighted it, the StratFi program. I think it's the conversion of programs like that into programs of record, and where we've seen a great amount of growth on the cyber side, on the willingness for the DoD, Pentagon as a whole, to work with startups. Like over the last decade, 2 decades, that has had a monumental change, and a lot of people, deserve kudos for that, both, inside and outside of the US government, for making sure that the willingness to talk to a startup, get to know a startup, give a startup an opportunity that wouldn't have been available to them, 2 decades ago. And that happens. And that's led towards a lot of the current day synergy you see between, government and the private capital community. But the StratFi being kind of the epitome of what's worked well there, then what happens next? Like, how do you get from R&D and some of these programs into procurement? That handover and that relationship, even within the Pentagon, is very distant. We've done a lot, even as a fund at times, to introduce the right person in procurement to the right person within R&D within the Pentagon to make sure that procurement knows what R&D is enabling, then an R&D knows who to hand over these successful companies to. Then that is a very nascent set of conversations and not directly tied. So I'd say kind of a structural issue that is starting to get attention, but is by far the biggest bottleneck as you look at these companies that have developed amazing capabilities. You look at the amount of capital that has flowed in from the Pentagon, from the private community, but there's just no place for them to land on the procurement side. By far the biggest challenge that those companies are going to face this decade.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. For Inversion, like, our customers are terrestrial customers, right? We deliver cargo terrestrially. Yes, we use the space domain, but we deliver terrestrially. And one of the big bottlenecks on that is getting involved in exercises, getting involved in demonstration, getting those ground groups to adapt and adopt those new ConOps, those new capabilities quite quickly. I think we've seen with Space Force and just in space in general, it's pretty quick to get a new startup integrated, as the startup generally is isolated from the rest of the service, and their products are isolated, and they just provide, whether that be data from imaging satellites or provide communications equipment. But if you actually have a product that integrates pretty deeply with operations, getting into demonstrations and getting into exercises, I think is a critical thing, and they don't happen on a startup timeline. They happen on a DoD timeline.
And Justin, do you think commercial space actually is a market? And what submarkets do you think are the most real?
Yeah, I think commercial space is a bit overhyped as far as like what the actual end users are going to be paying money for, right? So when we look at which markets we're going to go into, we basically look at who has the money to pay right now and what is the demand that we're filling, right? So fundamentally, we are filling a demand to move faster, right? And a lot of people are willing to pay a lot of money to move faster. But looking at purely commercial space and a lot of the kind of space to space companies and use cases, I think rely on a pretty large growth in the market and in the industry for the future. And I think a lot of times it's unclear on who actually pays, who's the end person that gets value and is funneling money to this. That is not just regular government grants or research and development stuff. And so I think there's probably a lot of thinning that is going to happen in the commercial space ecosystem over the next 2 to 3 years as venture capital has been tightened and kind of gets to the place where you need revenue from an actual customer rather than just some demo missions and R&D.
I'll add on to that as well that Justin's point of who is the end customer, who's paying. There's certain areas that have been they're massive investment sectors, get a huge amount of attention within the space community, but there is, that fundamental question I'll ask on space debris cleanup. Then you see lots of companies where their primary avenue and approach is, we're going to be collecting space trash and doing something with it. But it's a question of who will pay for that. Is that going to be the US government as a cleanup service or service cleaning the side of a highway? Then is that going to be the space operators? Is that going to be an attempt to tie who is that debris sourced to? What was the original source for that, and creating that as a liability for those companies? There's no clear answer there, and there's people working on it. But there's an imbalance there in even the private investment sector, where you see so many companies where their primary path towards monetization is trying to develop tech to capture space debris. But there is no ability to underwrite that investment as far as who is the end customer and even predict how that's going to play out well. It's very uncertain. So that's why for us, we've gone after companies where, some of them have extravagant tech development, extravagant even market development, but it's clear who it is that they're trying to manifest into that customer cohort. And not something where it's kind of a roll of the dice of hopefully someone else completely outside of their control will figure out how that market develops over time.
Yeah, and I'll add to that, like with space debris, like people have been talking about it forever, and like everyone says it's a problem, but nobody's going to pay for it. And in Jordan's point of like, is it like street sweeping? And let's say it is, right? Let's say it is just like a public good that we have to maintain these, maintain a clear low Earth orbit, let's say. You're not going to have any margins on that business, right? They're going to get competed away like nearly immediately. And so there's very little defensibility if you are the first company to get that. And I think that like that is a very important question to ask is like, how can you be defensible as a startup when you're going, why wouldn't 4 other companies come and do this like tomorrow kind of thing?
Yeah, and I know, Justin, you touched on this a little bit earlier when you were talking about Inversion's focus initially being on the commercial side and then shifting. But from both of you, I'd like to hear for dual use companies, should their initial focus be the government, the commercial markets, both? What plan should they take?
From my perspective, the initial use case should be commercial. And that's something that, there are exceptions to that. I'm actually really excited for Justin to comment because I think from both of mine and his perspective, commercial made sense to explore first. And Inversion is like a rare example of a dual use tech company. It's very rare for it to happen, but it happens occasionally, and it's happening in the right way with Inversion, right? Where defense moves faster, but that is not the norm. Like that's not the norm at all within the industry. And what we've seen happen successfully the most, that is for companies where they have a technology, they figure out a way for the commercial market to adopt that, or plan on adopting that in a way that leads towards private investment. That private investment lets that company grow to the point that they can get the resources to work with the US government. It's easier and easier every day for a startup to work with the US government, but it's still something that is a burden on a regulatory side, a compliance side, something that just takes time and resources. And you cannot, bottleneck a company in that often and see them come out the other side as a fast growing startup. So with that balance, go commercial first, bring in the private investors, shore the company up to the point that the company can work with the US government, bring them in as a customer or partner, and then have all that grow in sync after that. That would be my kind of like standard rule book, but there's always exceptions to that, which I'll hand the mic to Justin to highlight where, that always isn't or isn't always the right plan. I'd say it's a standard plan, but not always what ends up being right.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting dichotomy. So what we look at is what is the limiting factor for speed, right? In a lot of the kind of like standard dual use companies, the limiting factor is actually just bureaucracy, right? It is like the reason that commercial can move faster is because they have less bureaucracy. For us, and in other cases though, the limiting factor for growth is cost sensitivity. So for us, the DoD has a very strong reason to want to get things in very remote areas very quickly. But as costs come down, commercial starts to become interested in that, as well as some of our in-space applications as well. And this is a similar playbook that actually SpaceX took, right? Where they took government funding and they focused on government to start. That allowed them to reduce the cost of their vehicle and move into the commercial market, launching commercial satellites and then eventually building their own constellation. So I think there's kind of an interesting question when we talk about dual use, which is like, does it need to be dual use today? Or does it need to be dual use when it is at scale? And the cost savings happen when it's at scale, right? So for the DoD, they theoretically care about the cost of buying operational quantities of this system. And if they're at operational quantities, can that system be at the costs of commercial and apply to commercial? And if not, so for example, the F-22 will never have a commercial application regardless of what how many the DoD buys, then that is not a good candidate for dual use. But does it need to have a commercial application today? I think that is not necessarily the biggest deal, as long as there's clear path to a commercial application as costs come down with production and reduce the launch costs for us.
All right, I'm gonna shift gears a little bit, Jordan. Maybe this is a stereotypical investor question, but I'd love for you to talk about what you think of the current macro environment and its effect on startups.
Yeah, since the market crashed last year, it's been messy. It's probably the easiest way to summarize it. Then you see a lot of companies starting to hit trials and tribulations now that a lot of them raised through the bull market of 2020, 2021, beginning of 2022. And then kind of good times started ending, March, April of last year or so. And that's something that, as far as how that's played out, a lot of companies had, 18 months, 24 months of runway, were able to ride that out in a way that led towards them continuing to survive, to today. But you see a lot of companies out in the market, ones that have raised at massive valuations before, and some of those are continuing to carry those, if not increase those. But a chunk of those are ones that are falling flat, or if not, completely kind of shutting down operation. And that's something that we'll continue to see as companies that have been on life support essentially, start running into very high amounts of trouble with their financings. And then you see a lot of good companies as well that are stuck in positions where, with rates where they are, with liquidity fairly dry within the private markets, with expectations on IPOs and exit outcomes still being up in the air. We're seeing some good news and stability there in a way that should hopefully continue. But it gives a lot of uncertainty across the board for what is the right price for these companies. And for a lot of dual use tech companies and deep tech companies in general, they have a lot less short-term reliance on revenue for justifying what their valuation is. It's what's the exit outcome, what's the acquisition outcome, what's the revenue in years down the road after there's significant capital infused into those companies. So you see a lot of hesitancy in the investor base as far as, are these companies at the right price? Are they massively overvalued? If we wait 6 months, a year, are we going to get, a much better price on them? So a lot more kind of stress and tension on a fundraising side, but the best companies are still raising. Investors are still sitting on liquidity, they're sitting on dry powder, and they'll use those for the best companies out there. And we're lucky to work with a chunk of those that we see being active in the markets and continuing to fundraise and grow.
Great. Okay, Justin, passing it back to you. If you were to craft your dream program that would be run by the DoD and that would really support startups in the way that you think they want to be supported and should be, what would that program look like?
It's a good question. So I think there's like needs to be a balance of like actually measuring performance of startups, as well as like, where are we able to get to? So I think that it would be fantastic to have basically a cohort of startups that are all provided like a decent amount of funding after a proper vetting. So decent being 10 to 15 million, or in the 10 to 30 million range, let's say, that have venture backing. You do your proper diligence up front. Maybe there's some screening. And have that kind of cohort go through maybe a 1 to 2 year cycle to get to a demonstration and a exercise. Like perhaps even having a dedicated exercise for new technology could be really interesting, right? How does this one drone compete against the other? How does delivery from space compete against hypersonics? Like things like that. I think having a almost cohort-based system, and maybe it's actually a continuous system, but having regular demonstrations and exercises for startups could be a really fascinating thing. And that is kind of then the place where like you expect all of the procurement dollars to be signed at that exercise. And maybe that's the bridge the valley of death, which is, yes, capital is useful, but showing that the product is useful and showing that the team is able to execute, I think is a super important thing. Like, I think all startups should just be measured on their ability to execute, as well as their the value they're going to provide to the end user. And making sure that there is a way for startups to do that would be great.
I'll piggyback on that one as well. And we mentioned the StratFi TACFi program and the successes there. Like, I would love to see a continual expansion and growth of the scope of those, the dollar amount allocated for those. I think it's by far the most kind of synergetic and efficient fusion of private and public interests there, where the reception has been positive, essentially across the board, and the name is still not known well, across, a lot of communities, the name of that program. And but the way it works as far as having, signals from government interest, like government customer interest within there, matching funds to help to help grow, those companies, get them some non-dilutive capital while still bringing in the requirement for private capital interests. Then that private capital interest there and the kind of third matching distribution there puts that program in a way where it signals to the private investor that there is a customer coming, there is government interest. To the government customer, they see this is a good private company that private investors want to touch, which means that company will grow regardless, and that company will need less capital from the taxpayer in order to grow, and validates that as a company that is ran well, growing well. It validates the company itself, that it's not just someone who can produce tech, it's a growing, thriving company. So bringing that together in a way where everyone wins, everyone's paying less in, and everyone gets a good outcome from that, there has been strong success stories of the StratFi program almost across the board. That I just want more people to know about that. So it's to Jenna's question, it is kind of a dream program, like so far so good. Other than I wish more people knew about it.
The other thing I'll add is a mechanism to get startups facility clearances. Like, yes, we need to be careful with that, but there's like no good way to do that at the moment. And having, like, with the StratFi program, like that, a clearance is not attached to the StratFi program. And maybe it should, maybe it shouldn't be, but a way that startups who need that can actually get into that system would be tremendously valuable, I think, to the industry.
Awesome. We only have a few more minutes here, so I want to make sure we end on a super positive note. So from both of you, I'd love to hear what excites you the most.
I'll start, and I'll highlight, like, when me and Jenna first started Embedded back in 2020, she was running an event series, not too dissimilar to this, a private event series where she was bringing together founders that had experience working with the U.S. government and defense innovation leaders. And it was something, that was like 2018, 2019 or so, before the American dynamism movement that's happening within, kind of the venture community. A lot of where the transition of working in defense tech went from almost taboo in Silicon Valley to becoming a norm, if not like a, something to be excited about and hyped about within, a lot of the tech community. So it's seeing that movement where it's not something where it's like taboo to be working with the US government or talking to the Pentagon, or viewed that way. I personally don't feel that way, that it's taboo, but there was significant backlash at times for having that level of tech defense exposure. So seeing the community move on from that, the amount of amazing founders, the amount of support from the Pentagon and regulatory leaders, leaders on the Hill for having these startups grow and thrive and provide national security solutions. That's what keeps me excited, day to day.
Yeah, from my side, I think I've really seen that people understand within the DoD that innovation is needed, and new systems have to be built, and we have to move quickly and move aggressively on building new technology and getting it to scale and implementing it in a manufacturable way with domestic supply chains. I think there's kind of, in the last 5 years, been a major shift in that, where it's like, okay, yeah, we got to do this. And I think that's all for the positive.
Awesome, y'all. I feel like we covered a ton in a really short period of time. So I'm going to wrap us up here. Thank you, Justin and Jordan, of course, for your time. Thank you, America's Future Series, for having us. And I hope everyone has an awesome rest of their day.
Take care.
Thank you.